Thank you for checking out my YouTube channel today, The Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I'm your host, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined once again by Dr. Nakashian. Dr. Nakashian, thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, absolutely my pleasure. Anytime.
Many of you are going to be familiar with his work, and if not, I suggest you check it out. He wrote a book which is fantastic called Warrior Churchmen of Medieval England from 1000 to 1250, Theory and Reality. I'm actually going to include links to it in the video description below. Definitely check it out, buy it. It's absolutely fantastic, and I can't recommend it enough. Today, we're going to be doing a very special episode, which many of you are going to enjoy, on what was chivalry in the Middle Ages. And so he's going to walk us through that, and then I'm going to actually be asking a variety of questions posed by my subscribers to get his input so that your questions can get answered. Dr. Nakashian, thank you so much. I'm going to let you take it from here.
Yeah, thank you once again, for having me, Nick. I'm always happy to come on, and chivalry is a topic that I've always been really, really interested in. I probably haven't had a chance to publish on it as much as I would like, but I do talk about it in the Warrior Churchman book a little bit. Which I'll get into in a minute. Because we are living in the COVID-19 madness of the modern world, I opted to come to you from the ruins of Chepstow Castle. Behind me, it's one of my favorite medieval ruins, has the advantage of being reasonably intact, has a lot of fabric from multiple centuries, and belonged to William Marshall, one of the great figures of English chivalry that I believe you have Richard Abels coming on to talk about. And I'm very much looking forward to that. Richard Abels is spectacular. And the castle has the advantage of being about a half hour from my in-laws' house in England. So yeah, I've been there a lot. The alternative is my living room with a couple of kids and 4 cats and whatever other madness has descended on us. But anyway, all right. So yeah, when we first talked about this topic, medieval chivalry, I thought to myself, I would really like to kind of give an overview, to an extent of what was medieval chivalry, just sort of point folks in the direction of further research and give some, ideas of sort of what it wasn't, right? When I teach this in a few of my courses at Texas A&M University Texarkana, I cover it, from the perspective of, it's one of those words that a lot of us know. We probably don't use it much anymore, in all honesty, a little old-fashioned, but we've all heard it. And in the context that we use chivalry, we tend to use it as kind of good manners, right? If you show good manners, and it's gendered, basically it's usually men showing good manners towards women. The classic examples are like, opening the door for a woman or pulling her chair out or at a restaurant, provided she knows about it. Otherwise, it's just a terrible joke. But in any case, like, that's what we think of. That's chivalry, right? Chivalry is not dead. He held the door open or whatever. And in a lot of ways, we can thank our late 18th and early 19th century predecessors in the Romantic movement, for that image of chivalry, kind of glomming it on to this sort of Victorian notion of good guyism and gentlemanly behavior and all of that. And as Nick and I were talking before we started, I was thinking, if I did this talk on medievalism and medievalistic notions of chivalry in the 19th century, we could have a lot of fun reading, Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe and Alfred Lord Tennyson, and looking at Joseph Turner portrait, paintings, which I love. But that's what we think of as chivalry, and it gets kind of reinforced by Hollywood. Think about Knights of the Round Table or whatever with Robert Taylor and all that kind of fun stuff. But shockingly enough, that's not entirely what medieval chivalry was about. It has echoes, right? Parts of medieval chivalry have echoed down through the ages and sort of come to us in that sort of good manners or courtesy element of it, which was a component of medieval chivalry. But anyway, so let's actually get into the medieval part of chivalry. One of the advantages when we study chivalry in the Middle Ages is that it's actually a term that they used. Unlike some other terms that you might run into, chivalry is a medieval term. It's mostly French, right? Chevalier. And historians like Maurice Keene and Richard Kuiper, who I'll be talking a lot about, who was my PhD advisor, so I take that bias for what it's worth, have sort of played around with this idea of what did they actually mean when they said chivalry in the Middle Ages. as everyone in the world is on the internet these days, obviously bandwidth can be an issue. So I decided to instead, greet you from my living room rather than Chepstow Castle. You got to see it in the beginning. It's fine. But in any case, what was medieval chivalry? What did folks in the Middle Ages mean by chivalry, right? It's a medieval term. It could be used to refer to what a knight did in battle. You would see that where they would say, wow, Lord such and such did amazing chivalry at the Battle of wherever, right? You'll see examples of that. So it could refer literally to what a knight does in combat. It could also be used to refer to a group of knights, a lord and his following. You might see that as referred to as chivalry. So a lord comes around, comes to the battle, followed by his chivalry, or what have you. But generally speaking, it also, would be used to refer to sort of an ideology, an esprit de corps of the lay elites, for instance. And that's the one we're really going to focus on, this sort of general notion of how should knights behave, or what is it that we value in knights, or what should they avoid, or whatever. Like that whole discussion could also be used, could be referred to as chivalry. So when I think about chivalry, when I talk to my students about chivalry, we tend to approach it from the perspective of, how is it that knights could gain chivalric honor in the Middle Ages? That's sort of our starting point. If you're a knight, and it's 1150, and you want to know how you get to be considered to be a great knight of the realm, that's how we approach chivalry. Like, what are you supposed to do, right? And at the core of chivalry, and I think that a lot of the work that Dick Kuiper has done on this has been incredibly persuasive, but at the core of chivalry, I think, is knightly militaristic prowess. I think that it is really, really hard to approach chivalric ideology without understanding that the ability to do knightly violence in battle, and personally, you're not shooting bows and arrows at people. You're not throwing spears at people necessarily. You are doing, as Kuiper calls it, bloody, sweaty, muscular work with lance and sword. That's what prowess is. And in a lot of ways, I think sometimes as modern folk, we don't really like to think of it that way. That, we do like to kind of make it a little more antiseptic and think that chivalry was this kind of moderating influence on knightly violence, which I'll talk about at the end. And spoiler alert, it wasn't. But that's not all it was. Let's put it that way. But really at its heart, it was a valorization and almost a veneration of the ability to do violence. Knights were celebrated for their just straight up ability to fight people in combat, in hand-to-hand combat, and to defeat them. And to an extent, I guess that makes sense, right? If you're a knight who doesn't have a lot of prowess, you're probably dead. So, you're not around very long to build your reputation. I mean, all of these guys had to know basically what they were doing. And on the one hand, from a chivalric standpoint, or from a knightly standpoint, this focus on prowess could be a blessing, right? It could impel men to great deeds. And there's so many wonderful, wonderful examples that I'm going to get into, a little bit later on. But I'll just use a couple from the early or late 14th, early 15th century French chronicler Jean Froissart, where he's writing about the Battle of Crécy, 70 years earlier. And he tells a story about the aged, blind king of Bohemia who is fighting on behalf of the French. And he can't, obviously can't see anything. He's blind and he's old. And yet he wants to go down fighting. So he has his men bring him into the front of the battle so that he could swing a sword against the English. And they all tie their bridles together so that he can't ride away randomly. And he goes, and Froissart says after the battle, they find him dead, pierced by many wounds, and all of his knights still tied around him, having died defending him. So like to some chroniclers, prowess, great. He wanted to go do prowess, and he wanted to go be a knight even at the end, right? And William Marshall, another great example. Marshall, when he's probably in his mid 70s, at the Battle of Lincoln 2 years before his death. I think I talked about this in my Warrior Churchman one, I can't remember. But as soon as he hears that there's like a hole in the wall that they can reconnoiter, he just charges in. He's like, let's go get him, and everyone else is like, crap, there goes the marshal. And, so anyway, then there are countless thousands of other examples we could get into. But at the same time, this focus on prowess could be reasonably negative, right? In a variety of different ways. On the one hand, it could actually be negative in battle. Froissart, talking about Crécy, also makes the point that part of the reason why the French army lost was because even though the king had made the order, hey, let's stop and regroup and wait for the baggage train to reach us and all of that, he says pride and vanity took charge of events and each wanted to outshine his companions, so all the knights kept moving forward and they attacked the English army piecemeal. Now, we don't know if that's actually what happened, but to Froissart, that was sort of the knightly pride, the desire to do great deeds in battle, because it is kind of a zero-sum game. There's only a certain number of enemies you can kill. And if I kill most of them, then there's not that many left for you to kill. But also, prowess could frankly just push men to violence, self-destruction. In Kuiper's early work, he talks about chivalry connected to public order. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Kings in the 11th, 12th, 13th century who are struggling to build these kind of centralized governments using knights to help them do it are usually doing it by trying to prevent knights from causing too much violence, even though they're telling them that the way you earn honor is by doing knightly violence. So it's a bit of a contradiction there. So anyway, prowess, I think, is at the heart of what chivalry is in the Middle Ages. But it's not all it is, right? It's not just a berserker kind of warrior code of just go drink the blood of your enemies or anything like that. No, it's a lot more than that. And so you start to see these other sort of virtues coming up in the evidence as well. One of them is loyalty, right? Loyalty is huge to being considered chivalric. Frankly, William Marshall, use him as another great example, that was probably his best attribute. Most people considered him to be loyal kind of to a fault, I mean, he talks a lot about his prowess as well, but his loyalty was renowned. Whoever he served very loyally, even if he then ended up serving the person who was on the other side at the time later on. And it's a reciprocal relationship, between knights and lords. And you get lots of discussion of this. Knightly literature, imaginative literature, like the Song of Roland, for instance, which is probably one of the most famous ones. It's just suffused with this discussion. And if anyone has not read the Song of Roland, spoiler alert, at the I feel like it's 1,000 years old now. We can probably get away with it. But at the trial of Ganelin, at the end of the poem, that's literally the conflict that he brings up. That he didn't betray Charlemagne by selling out his army to the to the Muslims. He was just taking knightly vengeance, and that's okay. Why is the king getting so mad about this? And there's this whole wonderful interplay, and God gets involved, and there's some Old Testament stuff. But anyway, so loyalty obviously is vital, and we can talk more about kind of why that is in a in a lay elite society organized around personal bonds and so forth. It probably makes sense. Piety, right? Piety is a huge one as well. Service to God. But like we'll see in a few minutes when we talk about sources, that can mean different things depending on who you talk to, right? Does service to God mean service to the church? Yeah, sometimes. Sorry, needed some fortification. And, so service to the church, maybe, right? And certainly clerics who are writing about chivalry, yeah, amen. They're all about that. Yeah, that's of course what chivalry is. And some knights believe that as well. But they're not just sort of taking on whatever the clerics tell them and saying, yes, obviously this is what we have to do. There's also an independent component to it. Knights are forging their own relationships with God. When I was at Rochester doing my PhD, the monograph that Kuiper was working on was called Holy Warriors: The Religious Ideology of Chivalry. It's a brilliant book. University of Penn Press, 2009. Anyway. And in that, he talks about how knights basically forged their own relationships with God and developed this idea that they were doing God's work through the suffering of their everyday lives and through the suffering that they put themselves through on the battlefield. And not just like on crusade, like literally any time. You know, there's the great one from an English knight up in Scotland who's complaining about, like, you know, his armor's like rusted onto him and the guys all have dysentery and the horses are dying. And he's like, surely, you know, we're doing God's work up here, because who else suffers more for his benefit than us? You know, something like that. I can't remember the quote completely, but anyway, so piety, yes, obviously, you know, very important. Generosity, big one, right? Generosity and largesse, you know, looking out for your fellows. That's sort of a, you know, that's another very famous part of the William Marshall story, which I will leave to Richard to to talk about. But, you know, knights looking out for each other and looking out for their followers. And you could add others, right? Love, obviously, right? Courtly love, where'd that one go, right? That was one that we'll see, you know, with the knightly romances, and we'll talk more about those in a minute. You know, what role does the service of ladies play in chivalry? You know, and that's a fun one too. Things like compassion, things like mercy, right? That's another big one. And generally speaking, you know, that's kind of, I think, a decent overview of some of the attributes of chivalry. You know, and we can talk about those in detail if you want. So when and where does this happen? You know, where does chivalry come from? Yeah. The short answer is that depends, right? It's a tough one. And it's a tough one because we sort of know where it is, meaning like it's European, we'll put it that way. And it's the areas that I'm familiar with, Central and Western European down to the Mediterranean and up to Britain. So, you know, England, Scotland, France, Germany, Spain, to a lesser extent, maybe Italy. I don't know, it's a tougher one. And probably points east as well. But this is kind of a European Roman Christendom sort of phenomenon. And in terms of, you know, when it emerges, oh yeah, that's a tough one. We know kind of when we can look at medieval society and be like, yeah, okay, seems like there's chivalry there. And that's probably, you know, early 12th century, late 11th century, something like that. Before that, there are core elements of it, and we can trace some of those back and play with it and so forth. Who did chivalry apply to? I've been saying it a lot. This is basically the lay esprit de corps of the knightly class, and or the warrior elites of medieval society. So kings, dukes, counts, earls, sure, but also knights, and that is a whole other, in the early stages of chivalry, that's a whole other discussion, you know. But generally speaking, by 1100-ish, yeah, that's basically who this applies to. But there also were always aspirants to this as well. The folks that I work more on, clerics, they have a lot to say about chivalry too. Sometimes as observers, sometimes as promoters of reform, occasionally as practitioners, right? As Nick pointed out, the book I wrote, yeah, kind of talks a little bit about some of these clerics who want to do chivalry too. And then in the later periods, we can get into townsmen and peasants and yeomen and gentry and all that kind of fun stuff. And we are well on our way to then talking about Joseph Turner in 1830 or something. Anyway, let me finish up this sort of introductory part of the discussion with a discussion of how we know any of this stuff, right? As a historian, sources are really important, obviously. I talk to my students about this, right? That, you know, it's all well and good to know stuff, but we have to kind of know why we know stuff or how we know stuff. And I'm just going to cover some of the big overarching categories of sources that you can look to if you want to learn more about medieval chivalry. One is your standard medieval chronicle, right? Medieval chronicles are good. They're fun. I use them a lot. I'm mostly familiar with the English and French ones, but they're all over Europe. So depending on your ability to read vernacular languages or Latin, you can do Latin, just go to the originals, then chroniclers are going to talk a lot about knightly chivalry and the behavior of knights, because knights are the movers and shakers and elites of the medieval world, for good and ill. And most of these chroniclers are going to be clerics. A lot of them are going to be monks, but not all. And so you do have to kind of build that in, that these guys are coming to this with their own kind of perspectives, obviously. Some of them are knights who write them in the later periods. But there's too many chronicles to discuss, honestly, that talk about this. Go pick one up at some point and you will find one. You will find some reference to knightly violence. But they're all suffused with the language of knightly honor celebrations of knightly violence, but also concerns about it. Probably one of the best ones you can think of would be like Orderic Vitalis, who's an early 12th century Norman chronicler who writes in the modern edited edition by Marjorie Chibnall, I think it's 6 volumes. Brilliant edition. And he talks about the early history of Normandy and England and stuff, and all sorts of stuff about knights, both as heroes and villains. And so that's a nice introduction. You do get a few books of chivalry. There is the anonymous, I can't remember what it's called, Ordonnance des Chevaliers, I think, late 12th century. There's Ramon Lull, who is a 13th century Majorcan writer. He talks about chivalry, writes a book of chivalry. Geoffrey de Charnay in the 14th century in France writes a book of chivalry. Christine de Pizan, who's a 15th century French female author, she writes a book of chivalry. And you could even go further into Baltasar Castiglione, early 16th century. His Book of the Courtier has some evocations of chivalric ideology. Machiavelli even, kind of plays with it. So yeah, there were a few attempts throughout the Middle Ages to write the book on, these are my words on chivalry. And those are great, because it's someone sitting down and saying, by God, this is what chivalry is. And some of them are probably a little more useful than others. Charnay's a great one, because he was a knight, right? And he literally writes a book telling you, this is how you earn honor, and this is how you earn more honor. And it's fantastic. His thing that he keeps coming back to is, all knightly acts are honorable, but some are more honorable than others. And so here's your pyramid. If you're trying to get little, chits of honor, you'll get a few for doing this, you'll get more for doing this, more for doing that. And it served him well until he got killed at the Battle of Poitiers. So anyway, but he went out in a blaze of glory holding the Oriflamme of France. So anyway, he died the way he lived. And then another huge area, gigantic area that you can look to for evidence is imaginative literature. This is something, again, I'm kind of betraying my Kuiperian roots by talking about the use of imaginative literature in history. It's something that Kuiper has done extremely effectively for 30 plus years now at this point. And used correctly, these are, I think, incredibly useful. You've got your epics like the Song of Roland that we talked about. You've got epics like Raoul de Cambrai, the William of Orange cycle, all of these sort of things that are circulating. You've got the romances, right? Chrétien de Troyes, obviously, the French troubadour of the 12th century, Robert de Boron, also a French author, a cleric from the early 13th century. Wolfram von Eschenbach, the German knight who wrote Parsifal, is a great one. Malory, obviously the 15th century English knight. And those are all really, really useful, because those are, yes, they're fiction, but they are opportunities for essentially the popular culture of the Middle Ages that was aimed at the knights to sort of come through. And I'll come back to them in just a minute, because I'm going to tie it into my last point. But that's a huge area. And the great thing for folks who are interested in medieval chivalry is that those are usually accessible. A lot of those have been translated. A lot of those are used in literature courses. So yeah, you can go pick up a copy of Parsifal if you want to read 300 pages of German Arthurian romance. And like I said, used critically, recognizing, the limitations of fiction. They're just incredibly amazing wellspring of information. There's art, there's sculpture, you can access chivalry in almost any survival of the Middle Ages. And that tells us how important it was, right? This was a really important concept to these people. So my final point before we get to the questions is sort of answering a question that's not been asked as of yet, so stealing a base. But can we think of chivalry as a code, right? That's what I get a lot. In my undergraduate essays, the code of chivalry makes an appearance all the time. And the short answer is no, it was not a code. One of Kuiper's great allusions to it is that, in his full suit of armor, the knight did not have a little armored pocket for his little scroll of ye olde rules of chivalry, right? It doesn't work that way. It wasn't a code, meaning it wasn't codified, but it was, I think we could say, a shared series of ideals and anxieties, right? These are the things these folks are worried about. and that chivalry was a debate. It was a debate where these virtues, these ideals, these concerns are set against each other over centuries and over vast distances among various elite members of society in a whole variety of different survivals like chronicles and letters and biographies and imaginative literature. And they're all kind of engaging in this discussion about, what does it mean to be a great knight? What does it mean to be chivalric? Were there commonalities? Sure. Like I said, prowess, I think it's real hard to argue. It was not really important. But what about the limits of it? Bravery is probably an easy one. Like, yeah, you should be brave. But even there's some, there's some caveats. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Loyalty's a real tough one to have any caveats to. that was a pretty straightforward one. But it is a debate. And so one great example of that comes from Chrétien de Troyes' Lancelot, which is not one of my favorite romances, I'm not going to lie. But it is useful in a lot of ways. And there's a scene in it where Lancelot he's out riding and he runs into a knight who Lancelot had ridden in a cart to try to reach Guinevere, and this basically meant that he was seen as a criminal and a scumbag and all this other stuff, so he'd lost all of his honor. And this other knight makes fun of him for it, so he of course is like, well, I'm going to kill you now. And so they fight, and basically he defeats the knight who mocked him, and he condemns him to ride in the cart. And the knight's like, oh God, no, come on, don't do that. Kill me. That's better, Don't make me lose all my honor. I'm begging you. So he's essentially appealing to Lancelot's mercy. And Lancelot's like, I guess I should be compassionate to this guy. That's fair. And then a damsel shows up out of nowhere and is like, hey, would you do me a favor? And Lancelot's like, of course I would. You're a woman. Obviously I'm going to do you a favor. And she's like, hey, kill that guy. And Lancelot's like, and Chrétien puts in this wonderful paragraph that is literally like the ruminations of Lancelot going, crap, I don't know what to do. I mean, if I'm supposed to be generous to her, and that means kill the guy, but I'm supposed to be merciful to him, which means save the guy. I don't know what to do. This is impossible. I can't reconcile them. And, this is a great example of Chrétien making his knightly audience think, what do you do when these virtues of chivalry are in opposition? And what I love about it is the solution. It's prowess. He says, tell you what, let's fight again. And if I win again, I'm going to kill you. And the knight's like, yeah, fair play. So they fight again, and the knight loses, and Lancelot kills him and has no conscience. His conscience is clear. So, if we need a little reinforcement of why prowess matters, it's a solution too. But no, I mean, it's a debate, right? There's no code of chivalry like we might get, the Book of the Five Rings in Bushido or something much, much later on. We have those, but they're not issued by a duly designated government bureaucrat. Not everybody's carrying them around saying, yes, this is what chivalry is. But it is a shared series of virtues and values, but it's also a debate. And there's lots more examples of those we can play with, but I will pause there and address any questions you have.